Hi, my name is Pat Salmon, and I'm here today at the Olmsted-Beil House Park with the one and only Olmsted-Beil House, and we're here to talk about farming. Today is actually June 18th, 2020, and we thought it was a great day to talk about farming since it's right into the growing season. The first thing when I talk about farming on Staten Island is I usually mention that the first people to farm were the Lenape, who were residents of Staten Island, and they were here, prior to the arrival of Europeans. And they did their farming and their gardening and such, and they, grew beans and squash and corn, and those three crops were sacred to them, so that when the Europeans arrived, they learned from the Lenape how to make this land, later became Staten Island, learned how to make it work so that it would benefit them. And they too began growing the squash and the beans and the corn and things like that. So, if you jump back up to maybe 1682 or so, that is actually when this house was first established. It was sort of a little cellar-like cubicle that the first resident lived in, and his name was Reverend Patricia Salmon. He was not a farmer, obviously, if he was a reverend. He was in charge of what is now the Reformed Church of Staten Island that exists over in Port Richmond on Port Richmond Avenue. And he was not here very long. He had a great way with Native Americans. So he was sent up to live in what is now the Schenectady area, because it was believed by his church, which was the Dutch Reformed Church, that he could convert the Native Americans over to the Dutch Reformed religion. Anyway, the next group of people we see here at this house were the Poyans, the Poyan family. And these were farming people. The head of the household, he was also in charge of roads, which in the 1700s, it wasn't unusual to be a farmer, perhaps be also an oysterman, and perhaps be in charge of roads or be a deputy sheriff or a sheriff or something like that. So Poyan mainly used this acreage. Now this acreage went all the way from the beach all the way up to Amboy Road back when the Poyans were here. And I mean, that was a big chunk of property. I'd say it's about 175 acres, something like that. Well, the Poyans actually were very heavy into orchards and fruit trees and things of that nature. Most of the farms on Staten Island in the 1700s, they would have a little patch of woodland on the farm where they could get their wood to burn for heat and cooking, and they would leave a little area for putting in crops, like I said, the corn and the squash and the beans that they learned about from the Native Americans. But they were also planting on Staten Island at that time hay, because they had the animals. They had cattle, they had swine, they had these animals that they had to feed as well. So they were growing Timothy hay and they were making a living off that. But these particular Poyans, they decided that they were going to have an orchard, and the orchard flourished, and they did very well, the Poyan family. Now, after the Poyans left, the next family that comes in is the Journier family. They were neighbors in this area with the Poyans, and the Poyans didn't want the property anymore, so the Journiers took it over, and they too were farm people. Those were the main occupations in the 1700s. Farmer, oysterman, or perhaps you had a little shop where you sold goods. There wasn't a lot of diversity in terms of businesses and how you made your living back in the 1700s. So we have the Journier family coming in here. Now, the thing that we've been able to ascertain, we want further verification, but we're like 90% sure that both of these families enslaved African Americans. So we're almost confident. We need a little more research, but we're pretty sure that there were enslaved people on this property. And so that's something we need to look into further and research further and talk about further. But we want everybody to bear this in mind, because it's one of the most important aspects of how this property was used. Okay, so you go into about 1838. And who takes over this property but a man by the name of Dr. Samuel Akerly. And Akerly, he's not only a medical doctor, he ran the Deaf and Dumb Asylum in Manhattan for many, many years. Not only a medical doctor, but he's really interested in nature and natural history. And for our purposes, he's really interested in agriculture. So he comes here in 1838 with his kids and his grandkids. It's a rollicking spot here in the 1840s, family members all over. Dr. Akerly is retired. He's going to write his memoirs. He's going to go about and he's going to study the agricultural practices of the farmers on Staten Island, especially the farmers in this area, the Eltingville, Prince's Bay, Annandale area, Great Kills. And we are so fortunate that he wrote a report, a couple of dozen pages long, about agriculture on Staten Island in 1842. He actually went out, counted the number of people working in agriculture, how many pounds of hay was grown in Tottenville in that year, you know, how many pounds of cabbages were grown. He let us know that the Seguin family was probably the biggest cabbage grower around 1842 on Staten Island. But he put together all these amazing facts and figures. So I thought I would share some of this information with you. Dr. Akerly came upon and put it aside for us to learn about. So by 1842, the farmers on Staten Island are growing a variety of crops. They're growing Indian corn, wheat, potatoes, oats, rye, barley, buckwheat, hay, hemp, flax, and smaller quantities of wool from the sheep, hops for the lager, or actually lager hadn't yet arrived, but hops for whatever purpose, wax, they have beehives, they've got the bee culture going, and they were making with the silk cocoons and earning money off of that. In 1842, just in case you're on Jeopardy and Alex Trebek asks you, there were 912 horses and mules on Staten Island in 1842, 2,517 neat cattle, as opposed to the messy cattle, that's a joke, that's a bad joke, 136 sheep, and 3,180 swine, hogs or pigs. Imagine, there was $8,000 worth of poultry on Staten Island. So these are the kind of facts and figures that Dr. Akerly compiled for us. He talked about salt grass, which is like one of my favorite subjects. Salt grass or salt hay grows naturally in the it grew naturally in the wetlands of Staten Island, especially in the area of New Springville and Green Ridge. It was a naturally occurring hay-like grass. It was rather coarse, but it was grown and gathered by many, many families on Staten Island, and they made quite a living off of it. So he documented, you know, all about the native salt grass that was overflowed by the tides and harvested in September. It was not as valuable as fresh hay, but it required no plowing, no seeding. It was it was naturally occurring. So to think that most of the farmers in the 1800s thought that it would never get depleted, well, guess what? It did get depleted, although there were some instances where they were still gathering salt hay into the 1900s. Perhaps Dr. Akerly's most favorite subject was fertilizer. He loved talking about fertilizer. He said the strength of a farmer's barn lies in the fertilizer that he gets from his cattle and horses and things like that. He was crazy about fertilizer, let me tell you. He documented that some of the farmers on Staten Island were gathering a fish called the moss bunker from the waters off of Staten Island. They were putting it on their farm to fertilize in the off-season. You know, the fish would decompose, put nutrients back into the soil. But there was one problem. Moss bunker was kind of a smelly fish. So when the crops grew up, they might have this nasty fishy odor and taste and smell. So they didn't rely too heavily on the moss bunker fish. he noticed that you could buy something called street dirt. And street dirt is exactly what it sounds like. Street dirt was the accumulation of manure from horses and cattle in urban areas or urban type areas, and it was all mixed up with whatever fell into the street. And you could buy this for your farmyard, and you might get an occasional shoe in there, or a brick, or a couple of sticks, or whatever. But he said this was darn good fertilizer, and he encouraged people to use it. There was also something called night soil. Night soil is the accumulations from people waste. And he thought that was a fine type of a fertilizer too, once it had decomposed. So Dr. Akerly came up with all of these amazing facts and figures about farm life on Staten Island in the early 1800s. Unfortunately, Dr. Akerly eventually died. I believe he died, I want to give you the exact date here. He died on July 6th, 1845. His son-in-law was on vacation in Connecticut, and he just happened to be vacationing in the same place that Frederick Law Olmsted's father was vacationing. Now, Samuel Bowen was Akerly's son-in-law, and he was trying to sell this farm here, and he was telling Mr. Olmsted, Mr. John Olmsted, the elder, about this great farm on Staten Island. And, did he know anybody who might be interested? And, Frederick Law Olmsted heard about this farm on Staten Island. He, at this time, was at Sakeham's Head in Long Island. He wasn't happy where he was farming at that time in the 1840s. He was growing potatoes. Thought the soil was not so good. It was very rocky. He was very disappointed with that situation he was in. So when he heard about this Staten Island farm out here in Eltingville, he said, I gotta check this out. And he did. And he went back and he got his father to purchase this farm for him. So the Akerly family sold the farm to the Olmsted family, and Frederick Law Olmsted moved in here in 1848, March of 1848. He was a potato farmer from Long Island. So, he went to work here on the property and thinking about what he was going to do and how he was going to do it. And he started thinking about the landscape and how to improve the landscape. Maybe move a barn here or move a barn there, put in a pond there. Maybe move the house. He was thinking about moving the house at one point. Maybe make the driveway sweep in so it'll look better. So he's formulating all these ideas about landscaping. But he's also a farmer here on Staten Island. Well, his brother comes along, Brother John, and they decide to go with their friends, Charles, Laurie, and Brace, on a walking tour of the British Isles. And while they're there, they're looking at the farms there. They're looking at what the farmers are growing. They're entranced by the farms that they see, especially in Britain. But Olmsted starts really focusing in on trees and shrubs and fruit trees and things like that. So while he's in Europe, he orders a couple of thousand shrubs and saplings and things like that to be sent back to the United States, back to Staten Island, because he wants to plant them on his farm. Well, eventually he gets back to Staten Island. Eventually the fruit trees and the samples all show up. And another interesting point here to make is that at this time, now we're talking 1850s or so, excuse me, Olmsted has working for him 6 or 7 Irish immigrants. 4 or 5 of them are men, and they're helping him on the farm. And he's got a couple of Irish girls working in the house. So here we have another wonderful topic to talk about in Olmsted-Beil history, is the fact that there were Irish immigrants working on this property after the famine, after the Great Immigration, after the Great Hunger. Anyway, back to Olmsted and his trees, because that's important. Olmsted had all these trees delivered, and he got very involved with peach trees, fruit trees, peach trees, pear trees, probably apple trees too. But in that pile of trees that were sent to him from Europe, there were some oddities in there. There were a couple, not a couple, there were cedars of Lebanon. This is a tree that doesn't even grow in this area. They grow in the Holy Land, cedars of Lebanon. He plants them, a couple of them here. And he plants a black walnut tree. Look at this giant that's here behind me. He plants that. He plants Osage orange trees all over the place, and they're still standing. Ginkgo trees still standing. Southern magnolia, they're still standing. These are trees that Olmsted, planted on his farm. And he nurtured them, and as I said, they're still growing today. It's an amazing thing. So this batch of shrubs and plants and things that came from Europe had all these different species. There was horse chestnut was in there. There were different kinds of beech trees. There was the European beech. I think he got his hands on a few American beech, which was a native species to Staten Island. But all of these non-native species, and they're still doing fabulous here. After his trip to Europe, he grew somewhat disillusioned with farming. Started thinking all about landscaping and the way landscapes should look, and parks. He was amazed with the parks he saw in Europe. Why can't we have that in our country? And he got involved shortly thereafter with Central Park and eventually Prospect Park and the Buffalo Parks, and the list goes on and on and on and on and on. But this was the incubation site for Frederick Law Olmsted, originally who came here to farm. Our next person who bought the property, his name was Dr. Anderson. He was a physician at the Seaman's Retreat. And he planted around here specialized kinds of fruits and vegetables, those kinds of fruits and vegetables that he deemed would be good for his ailing patients, for his sick patients. He thought particular varieties of this produce would benefit the sick, bring them back to good health. He owned the property for about 10 years or so, and after that is really the last time that we see farming going on at what is now the Olmsted-Beil Park. Certainly there was farming going on Staten Island beyond that time period, especially on the West Shore and in Mid-Island. And I mean, we could have another whole discussion about those farmers. We had Greek farmers coming in and Italian farmers coming in, but we'll save that one for the next time. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Oh wait, I want to show you one wonderful artifact that we have here, courtesy of Tina Casman-Dunn. It's a plow. She tells me that it's a handheld plow. You sort of grab it by the handles. There's a sharp metal piece at the bottom that furrows the soil, and the farmers would push this along, and they'd furrow, and then they drop the seeds on their farms. She tells me this is circa 1890s or thereabouts. So it's a wonderful artifact that we have here on the property now. So I think that's it for now. So thanks, and make sure you become a member. Go to Olmsted-Beil-House.org. You can join the Friends of the Olmsted-Beil House. Keep an eye out on our Facebook page. We're on Instagram, we're on Twitter. We are just PR mavens over here, so join us, follow us. We'd love to have you come to some of our programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. It's fabulous once again.